muscle tissue. So we ended with, I kind of briefly introduced the idea or the topic of how our muscles actually make ATP over the course of exercise. So we're going to go into some detail on that right now, kind of the different stages of ATP production during exercise. So this was the last slide, I think, that I covered. There. On Wednesday. So our muscles do both anaerobic and aerobic respiration. As a reminder, anaerobic respiration is far less efficient. It does not make nearly as much ATP as aerobic respiration does. So for the most part, thankfully, our muscles do aerobic respiration. So I'm going to talk about the trajectory from like the beginning of exercise until basically about 40 seconds in. A lot of stuff happens and we switch from aerobic to anaerobic and then back to aerobic respiration with our muscles. So I'm going to talk about that over the next few slides. So here's just a simple diagram of the process and the different stages of ATP synthesis during exercise. So we start out with, and I'll detail these on the next slides with some, or I'll give additional details on the next slides for each of these stages. We start out with aerobic respiration, move into something called the phosphagen system, and then right after that into anaerobic respiration or fermentation. And then eventually we get back to aerobic respiration. So we kind of switch back and forth, our muscles switch back and forth between these different processes for creating ATP. This is all about creating ATP. So ATP is the energy source for cells. That's what we're doing over these next few slides. So short, intense exercise. So let's imagine we're right at the beginning of that timeline. At the very beginning, when you start exercising, your muscles are doing aerobic respiration and they're getting oxygen. So aerobic respiration requires oxygen to happen. That's why it's aerobic versus anaerobic. Your muscles are getting oxygen from something called myoglobin. Does that sound, do you guys know another globin that you've heard of in the body? Hemoglobin, yeah. So hemoglobin, myoglobin, they both carry oxygen. So they're molecules that carry oxygen. Myoglobin carries it specifically to muscles, hence the myo. So it's carrying oxygen. That's pretty quickly depleted at the very beginning of the exercise process. So initially myoglobin is providing oxygen for aerobic respiration. Within a few seconds after that, the phosphagen system kicks in. So the myoglobin reserves are depleted, no more oxygen is available on the myoglobin. And then comes the phosphagen system, where muscles are getting ATP essentially by stealing phosphates from other molecules. So if you guys remember, ADP is adenosine diphosphate. We need one more phosphate group to make it adenosine triphosphate, the ATP that the cells can use. So the muscle cells will steal a phosphate group to make ADP into ATP from other molecules. So it's generation of phosphates is a way to think of, that's why it's called phosphagen. So kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, stealing phosphates from other molecules to allow ATP to continue to be made once the myoglobin reserves have been depleted. So this whole process from kind of the beginning through the phosphagen system can last for 6 to 8 seconds, so not very long. This all happens pretty quickly, and we're talking fairly intense exercise here, not just like walking down the hall. So imagine like sprinting or something. So for 6 to 8 seconds, this is what your body's doing very quickly, right? And then it switches over to the anaerobic form of respiration. So the phosphagen system gets exhausted. Muscles then start undergoing fermentation. This is an anaerobic process. No oxygen is needed. And this is called the glycogen lactate system because it's converting glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose, so glycogen or glucose, into lactate. And I mentioned this on Wednesday, but that lactate is toxic in high amounts, so it needs to be disposed of and detoxified by the liver. So this process is creating something that needs to be gotten rid of by the body, that lactate. And it's also only producing 2 ATP for every glucose molecule that's consumed. Two ATP is not a lot of ATP. When we get to, I think it's the next slide, the longer term back to aerobic respiration, you'll see that 36 ATP are produced when we go back to the aerobic form. So 2 versus 36. This fills a void where there's no oxygen. And so this has to happen, but it's very inefficient, anaerobic respiration. So this will get you to about 30 to 40 seconds of pretty intense activity. So from that 8 seconds to 40 seconds, the end of the phosphagen system to the end of the glycogen lactate system, that's the anaerobic respiration phase. Your muscles are getting ATP, just not a whole lot. And then after that, after about 40 seconds, your body, your cardiovascular system and your respiratory system basically catch up to the oxygen demand, and your cells, your muscle cells can go back to aerobic respiration. So it just switches back. It's just your heart and your lungs basically have to kind of catch up and start producing more oxygen and moving more oxygen in order for enough oxygen to be sent to your muscle cells for them to make ATP. And that happens, this is all within basically 40 seconds of intense exercise. So it all happens really quickly, but those are the stages that your body goes through, your muscles go through to produce ATP. And here, like I said, aerobic respiration, now that we're back to the aerobic form, your muscles are getting 36 ATP for every molecule of fuel, which is glucose typically, that's being used. So 36 is far higher than 2. It's a lot more efficient if you have enough oxygen getting to your muscles. So that wraps up the trajectory of ATP synthesis. It can obviously kind of switch back. If you increase your intensity or decrease your intensity, you might switch back to anaerobic if your respiratory and cardiovascular system can't keep up. So it's not just, necessarily, it doesn't necessarily go in only one direction. But this is the general trend. And your muscles likely get tired after a certain period of time. So muscle fatigue happens, depends on your fitness level, how quickly it happens, but it pretty much will happen to everybody because your muscles just get tired from working due to prolonged use. It's due to a number of things. If we look at it at the molecular level and the cellular level, it's kind of interesting to think about what's actually going on when your muscles are getting tired. So this is a list of 5 different things that actually occur. So it's not just one thing that's making your muscles tired. It's one or more of these, kind of a combination of all of these factors. So first, fatigue can be due to obviously not enough fuel. So if you don't have enough glucose or glycogen being broken down to produce ATP, your muscles are going to get tired. These next 2 are sort of issues with different molecules and ions sort of gumming up the works is a way to think of it. Too much potassium or too much ADP can kind of slow everything down. So too much potassium in the T tubules, which is where that electrical signal, the action potential, goes into the cell to release the calcium. If there's too much potassium in there, it can slow down that action potential, which means less calcium is released, which means fewer and or slower contractions of the muscles. If there's too much ADP, it can affect the binding of the myosin and actin when those cross bridges are created. So again, kind of gumming up the works, just kind of getting in the way. And basically not enough ATP to make that happen, because you need ATP to create those cross bridges. And then something most of us are probably fairly familiar with, electrolyte loss. So sodium and potassium, we know why sodium and potassium are really important because of the sodium potassium pump. Without that, you don't have that electrical signal being sent, which kind of negates the rest of the contraction process. So you need these electrolytes. They're just salts, basically, and you lose those when you sweat. So that's why if you're sweating a lot, drinking something with electrolytes in it like Gatorade rather than just plain water can help your muscles, because you need that sodium and potassium for the muscle contraction process. And then this last one is really interesting, mostly because we don't really know a whole lot about it. We know that ammonia is generated by muscles when they contract. That ammonia is just kind of a byproduct, a waste product. That ammonia essentially inhibits motor neurons in the brain. So it's not directly inhibiting the muscle contraction, it's inhibiting the neurons that are sending signals to the muscle to contract. And that's the part that's not really well understood, why ammonia inhibits those motor neurons. So from a molecular point of view, that's not well understood. But this is where that kind of endurance and psychological factors can come into play. So if you're running a marathon, yes, your muscles are going to get tired, but a huge part of it is also, can your mind actually continue to function when your muscles get really tired? So the psychological factor of fatigue and endurance is where the central fatigue idea comes in. So some people are better at it than others. Is that physiological or is it kind of more psychological? That's kind of an area that's interesting and still being researched. All right, so that's why your muscles get tired. Next time your muscles are tired, you can think about all of these different aspects and curse the potassium accumulation in your T tubules. All right, one other concept dealing with exercise, and this is really post-exercise. So EPOC is the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. It's a big term. So what this is after you stop exercising, you're still taking in more oxygen than you would if you had never exercised in the first place. So if you look at this graph, the resting O2 requirement is this bottom line. I know it's super tiny print here, sorry, but here, this is where, and I also don't have a y-axis. This is a terrible graph. So the y-axis is oxygen consumption. So this is where you are just at rest, right? So that baseline of oxygen consumption. And then say you exercise, you get some spikes in your oxygen consumption. And then this is the line where the exercise ends. So you stop exercising, but you're still consuming for up to an hour or two afterwards, a lot more oxygen than you would in a resting state. So this area under this curve is the EPOC, that excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So it's just the difference between the elevated rate of oxygen consumption after exercise is over and where it would normally be at a resting state. It tapers off. We don't even see the end of it here in this graph, but it'll taper off and eventually, assuming you don't start exercising again, get back down to that baseline oxygen consumption. But this is necessary for a few reasons. You have to replenish the ATP that was used. And to do that, at least efficiently, you need oxygen. So by taking in a lot more oxygen, you're replenishing the ATP stores in your muscles. So next time you exercise, those are ready to go. You have to replace those oxygen reserves on myoglobin. So the myoglobin is what's carrying oxygen in that very beginning stage of exercise into the muscles. So it carries oxygen, but it needs access to oxygen in order to carry it. So you're kind of recharging the myoglobin. It's a way to think of it. And then because inevitably you probably went into anaerobic, assuming you exercised for more than 8 seconds, you went into anaerobic respiration, you need to get rid of that lactate that was produced through anaerobic respiration. And for the liver to do that, it needs oxygen. So the EPOC can be pretty high. It can be up to 6 times as high as the basal rate, which would just be oxygen consumption at rest. And like I said here, it can last an hour, potentially more, depending on the intensity and length of exercise. So you guys are probably familiar with this, that after, say, you go for a run and you stop running, you don't just stop your elevated breathing right away, right? You have to kind of slowly taper back down. That's the idea behind EPOC. All right, so that's all the skeletal muscle stuff. Like I said, all of that really dealt primarily with skeletal muscle. I have, I think, 4 slides here on cardiac and smooth muscle. So that's all I'm going to talk about from the tissue perspective and really the muscular system. We're only going to talk about skeletal muscle for the most part. So this is just a little kind of a reminder that yes, there's these other types of muscle tissue. There's cardiac and smooth muscle tissue. So I just want to talk about a few basic characteristics of them and kind of how they differ from the skeletal muscles or skeletal muscle tissue. In skeletal muscle, the cells are called myofibers because they're fibrous, they're really long. In smooth and cardiac muscle, they're called myocytes. So just muscle cells, myocytes. They're shorter and they only have 1 nucleus. These are involuntary tissue types. We can control when we move our skeletal or contract our skeletal muscles. We cannot control when our heart beats, so when our cardiac muscles contract. And we can't control when our smooth muscles contract, like in our digestive system. We can't control how it moves food through. It just happens. So it's innervated from the autonomic nervous system, controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which we haven't talked about. That'll be one of the very last things we go over in this class. But the autonomic nervous system is the unconscious nervous system. Controls, obviously, heartbeat, breathing, smooth muscle processes, among a number of other things. So I think of autonomic as like automatic. It just happens. You don't have to think about it. Okay, so different innervation, not voluntary, and the cells are different as well. So there's just some main differences. I'm going to talk now about some properties of cardiac muscle tissue that are really important. First, the cardiac muscle tissue contracts with a very specific and regular rhythm. Ideally, assuming your heart is working fine, it's contracting with a very regular rhythm. Thankfully, these muscle tissues and muscle cells are also really resistant to fatigue. We don't want our heart getting tired. And we haven't gone over the heart. That's something the circulatory system will get covered in AMP2 if you go on to that class. But you probably have a general idea that the heart is made of different chambers. So the blood moves through the heart in a specific pattern through those chambers. So the muscle cells of any given chamber all have to work in unison and contract in unison in order to push that blood into the next chamber or out of the heart if it's going elsewhere. So everything has to contract in unison in one chamber, and then it moves to, the blood moves to the next chamber, that next chamber has to contract, etc. And the contractions have to last long enough to actually expel all the blood from that chamber. And then finally, our heart tissues, muscle tissues, never go into anaerobic respiration. They don't do fermentation, they only do aerobic respiration. And that's all I'm going to say about cardiac muscle tissue. AMP2, you'll get into plenty of detail about the cardiovascular system. Smooth muscle. It's smooth because it doesn't have striations. So you don't have those really distinctive sarcomeres that you have in skeletal muscle. As far as innervation goes, some smooth muscle tissues or smooth muscle cells don't have any nerves actually going into them. So some of them are not innervated at all. But a lot of them receive input from that autonomic nervous system. So the unconscious part of our nervous system. And smooth muscle is typically found within hollow organs. So it's lining the walls of a lot of our hollow organs, like I keep saying the digestive tract, just because it's one that we're all fairly familiar with. Capillaries, or blood vessels, are also considered sort of hollow organs, and they have smooth muscle lining them as well. So the muscle will contract in our capillaries to allow for basically specific levels of blood pressure, to keep blood from pooling down in our feet when we're standing up, that kind of stuff. But in the digestive system, it's propelling food through the digestive system. So kind of long, slow contractions are the typical type of movement of these muscle tissues. Okay, and I think that's all I have on smooth muscle. Yes, okay. Everyone caught up? That is the end of muscle tissue. Sorry, that's a really long chapter, a really long and detailed chapter. So what we're gonna do now is, like I said, the process of muscle contraction, I went over those 18 really detailed steps. I've kind of broken those down or simplified them down into 8 steps that give you an overview of what's happening. You still want to know all of those 18, but you can simplify it down. So what I want you guys to do, you guys on Zoom, I'll show you where you can do this in just a second. But you guys in class, if you'll pair up or get in groups of 3, whatever you want to do, 2 or 3, I'm going to hand out a stack of 8 different actions that happen during a muscle contraction. So starting with, I'll give you a hint, the very first of these is going to be when acetylcholine is released from the nerve. So the nerve is going to send the signal to the muscle. And then from there, you're going to put the rest of, that's going to be your first step, which is in here. You're going to put these steps in order. So just line them up on your table. Try doing it without your notes at first, just so you can kind of get an idea, kind of try to reason through what you remember about this process. And then if you have to go to your notes, that's perfectly fine. So if you'll get in your groups, I'll bring these around. And then you guys on Zoom, there is a document called the Muscle Contraction Worksheet. It looks like that. It's just a bunch of steps with lines next to them, and you can use that to put these steps in order. All right, I'm gonna stop recording for a bit. So if you guys can download that,